Typical workbook in Excel can have many cell references. And because these references are generic and cell focused, it can make formulas more difficult to read and understand. But you can also add a more descriptive and intuitive name to any range and then use those named ranges in your formulas. Let's look at working with range names in Excel. Microsoft Excel makes it easy to name individual cells or cell ranges so you can find data by a logical name and refer to cell ranges in formulas. Common uses for a named range include formulas and functions, which is the focus of this training. However, named ranges can also be helpful for navigation and printing, tables and pivot tables, advanced filters, and even macros. Here's an example of using a named range for navigation. In this workbook, I'd like to move to a total for sales. Well, that already has a name, and one way to get there is through the name box, which is just to the left of the formula bar. In this dropdown, then I'll move to sales total. So you can see that that's pretty straightforward as well. And there is my sales total. Whether it's on row 79 or 7900, I can go right there and I don't have to remember what the cell address is. Next, let's create our own name ranges. I like to name this total in this Tropical Trips worksheet. So once again, we'll go back to that name box. Here, I'll click into the name box and call this Trips Total. So there's a couple things to keep in mind about the names, and we'll go into this in more detail. First of all, no spaces or other punctuation is allowed in the name that we're going to use here. And I'm also using something called title case. Not required, range names are not case sensitive, but it makes it a little bit easier to see or to separate the words in the description for this. And now I'll finish it with an enter. So now I'll move to another sheet so we can see how easy it is to be able to navigate. And I'll go to the name box. Here I have trips total, and that becomes my option. Now I could also use go to. So go to is either the F5 function key or Control G for go to. Let's try that. Here we'll see not only the most recent locations we've moved to, but also any current range names in this workbook. And here is once again my sales total, and I'll move to that. As you start creating named ranges, it's helpful to understand what the rules are. I've touched on a few of these. A range name must begin with either a letter or an underscore. So although numbers are allowed, they can't be in that first position. They cannot resemble a cell address. So you can't do, for instance, FY 2024, because that is actually a cell address. No other punctuation is allowed except for the underscore. So no spaces, no periods, etc. As we saw, title case names can be helpful, and they can be up to 255 characters long, but it's helpful for them to be descriptive, but certainly much shorter. It can also be useful to be consistent. So if you're naming different regions, for instance, you might do region SW for Southwest and then region NE for Northeast, simply so that they are grouped and ordered together. This will make it a little bit easier for you and other users to locate those names. The name box isn't the only way that we can add a name to a cell or range of cells. We can also do this through a dialog box. So here I'd like to label this total. First, we'll move to formulas, and then we have this grouping for define names. We'll do a number of things from here. Here is define name. So I'll call this Southwest total. Once again, no spaces for this. In the scope dropdown, you can either indicate that the name applies to the workbook overall, or it's only for a specific worksheet. For this name, we'll pick workbook. I'll explain more about scope later in this lesson. If desired, you can type in a comment that more fully explains the meaning of the name cell. So this can be up to 1,000 characters, which is probably a lot more than what you need, but it can appear as a tooltip when you are building or using the name in formulas and functions. Confirm the cell or range of cells that you are referring to, and then choose OK. Another way to easily create named ranges is from a selection. From here, I'll highlight then my data for the different locations and the quarters. Next, we'll go back once again to the Formulas tab, and here is Create from Selection. That is also Control-Shift F3. Confirm that you want to create the names from the values in the top row and or the left column, as well as the other locations. I'll keep these as indicated and choose OK. So now let's see what happened here. One of the ways to manage our named ranges is through the Name Manager, also here in the Formulas tab. And we can see that we did a lot of work there with just that one action. Each of those quarters has a range name. And notice the underscore in front of those numbers because numbers cannot be in that first position. Each of the countries has a range name, and an underscore is used for the space between some of those particular locations. If I wanted to see this a little bit more easily, I could click on the heading for refers to, and that would put all of the named ranges together that are in tropical trips, for instance. And that makes it a little bit easier to review because there may be some that I simply don't need. That was a really quick, easy way to do that through the selection. Go ahead and close for now. And how do we get to those name ranges? As we saw earlier, name ranges are quickly found and selected for you. So the name box is one option. And here we can see all of those range names that either were already existing in this workbook or that we just recently created. Or we can press Control G or the F5 function key, and that will open up our go-to. And if, let's say, I want to see the range name for Bahamas, simply select it and choose OK, and there it is. Range names can also help us in formulas where we might otherwise need to use absolute references. For instance, here I have a formula to calculate the commission, and it is currently referring to cell F2 as an absolute reference. To learn more about absolute references and other cell references in Excel, click the link above or look for the link in the description below. So naming ranges offers an easy alternative to working with absolute references and formulas. That is, instead of having to remember where to put the dollar signs, you can just use the appropriate range name in your formulas. Let's try that. First, I'll delete what I had here before. And now I want to name this range. So I'll move to this reference here or this percentage and give it a range name, commission. Let's create the formula now using that range name. So the commission is equal to this total times, we'll go to the 12% and look what happens. So Excel automatically populates this with the named range, commission. So with a named range, an absolute reference is actually implied. But the usage and understanding can be so much simpler because now all I have to do here is copy this down and I have a commission calculated in each one of those cells. That is the total multiplied by what we see in F2, which has the label commission. And in case it bothers anyone here, I'm going to use the format painter here. I'll move to the cell to duplicate the formatting over to the right-hand side. That's under the Home tab. Here's my handy-dandy paintbrush, and I'll simply duplicate the formatting into that cell. And if we want to view, edit, delete, create named ranges, keep in mind we can always do that from the Name Manager. So once again, under Formulas, here is my Name Manager. This is another way for us to create a brand new range name. We could edit existing ones. For instance, maybe we need to change the cells that are being referred to. We could even delete range names that we no longer need. And if I expand this a little bit here, we can see the comment that we added for that earlier one. Let's sort this now alphabetically again. Click at the top here of this range. And if there's something that we no longer need, for instance, as we work with it, we always have the opportunity to delete that. Let's say I don't need this trips total here. Could select it and choose delete. Let's simply respond to that prompt. So we can get to the Name Manager here from the Formulas tab. You can also press Control F3. That's another way. But this becomes a great way for us to look at it. Now, by default, each range name has a scope of the entire workbook. You can see that here in this column. That means it can be referenced throughout the workbook. However, this also means that the range name can't be repeated unless the scope is changed. So we're going to look at the scope in a minute. First, let's see how we can refer to a range name from a different worksheet. So we had created this commission range name, and we're going to use it in a different worksheet. But from here, I'll create a formula that refers to that. It'll simply be equal total times, and I don't have to click on that cell or move to that cell. I can simply start typing the range name. Now notice as I'm typing that we're going to see first functions that start with those letters, but as I continue typing here, we'll see any range names that might match, and in this case, I want commission, so I can double click or arrow to it and tap. That's all I need for this one, and I can copy that down then as well. So it's actually referring to commission, which is not in this sheet. It's in a different sheet, but it will still work for us. Now let's see what happens here. What if I come back to and change this commission rate? So instead of 12%, what if I make that's 20%? It's not only going to impact this sheet, but it will impact the other as well. So let's make note real quickly here of what this total looks like, a little over $180,000. And now let's say I change that to 20% because I'm feeling very generous. It impacted this total, but also this one as well. Before you create a named range, consider how you'll want to use the worksheet overall. Will you want to duplicate the worksheet? For instance, is this a monthly worksheet that you copy for each month? Let's see what happens with the second quarter sales. Let's say we want to create our third quarter sales. I'll move to that worksheet tab, hold Control to create a copy, and drag this. I'll just let go with my mouse first and second. Now, some versions of Excel may prompt you about the duplicate range name. In this case, it didn't. Here, I'll rename this because I want to build my third quarter sales from this. Now, let's next go to the name manager to see the differences between the original and the copy. From here, we can see that we have commission in two different places. One is only in the third quarter sales worksheet. The other is workbook wide. And this can start to make things a little bit confusing in terms of that scope. But let's see what happens here. In this case, then, if I was building that formula, we can see that it is multiplied by the commission. Now, if I'm moving along, if I'm just creating this from scratch, let's see what happens when I go into commission. Notice that I can pick either the one that is workbook wide, which would be the one in the other worksheet, or this one. So a little bit of a difference here because now the scope is just the third quarter sales commission. Different from the other one that is just commission. If I change this, for instance, to 10%, we can see what happens here. And I'm changing it here, but we don't see the change here. So what's the solution? Well, not surprisingly, there are many different options and solutions possible. But let's look at how we could limit the scope to the worksheet level. I have the same idea here, second quarter sales. And for this, I'm going to create this then as define name, and we'll call this commission scope. And what happens here is we'll simply say that the scope is just for this worksheet rather than having it be workbook wide, and then OK for this. Now, if I say equal to times, no problem with it. I can reference this, but it's only in this worksheet. That is, if I move to a different worksheet, I don't even see that name range or that commission scope available because it's limited to just that location. This makes it a little bit easier now if I make a copy of it. So if I make copy, control drag for this, for instance, let's say I rename this, I'll call this my fourth quarter just to make it a little bit distinctive from the other ones. And now if we look at the name manager, here is my commission scope. And that makes it much simpler for us to be able to make changes from one to the other. You can see then the values are indicated here as we have those different commissions. So consider whether or not the scope might be a better option for you as you're building formulas and working with those. Let's wrap up by looking at a couple of examples of how range names can also be used with functions. And for this, here I'm in a quota worksheet. I've got one range name for commission rate, and one easy way to know if this has a range name, by the way, is if I move to that cell, notice my name box. Here's commission rate. And I have another one here for quota. In this cell is a simple if statement, an if function, that's simply evaluating if the total is greater than or equal to quota, whatever that might be, then say yes. Otherwise, say no. And this is a much better use by using the if function as well as those range names. It's straightforward. We're able to see what the intention is, and we're not plugging that number in directly because perhaps we want to do some projections and say, what happens if it's 50,000? What happens if it's 80,000? Those types of things. So this becomes a great way to be able to utilize those. And likewise, we also then have that commission rate is being calculated too here in a simple formula. Here's another example. In this worksheet, we're using sum if and average if to be able to do some calculation. And with both of these functions, they work with conditions or criteria. So instead of just a sum, we're going to sum based upon that criteria. For this one, it's simply going to sum if country, which is what we have as a range name in green here, just to make that a little easier to stand out. If the country and the second argument in here is matches whatever we see in B21, then sum what is in column C or the range name called fee. So although those could be literal references, by giving these range names, we hopefully add a little bit more clarity to the formulas, especially because they could be much more complex than what we see here. And then, of course, if we change that criteria, which is another option here, because we have those criteria or those conditions, it will very easily then update the results that we have in this worksheet. Now you've seen how working with name ranges can make your formulas in Excel easier to write and understand. To learn more ways to be productive with Microsoft Excel or to join my free tips newsletter, visit thesoftwarepro.com/Excel. If this training was helpful, please subscribe to this channel for other time-saving software tips. Thanks for watching.